In the dusty cattle town of Amarillo, Texas, 1887, widowed rancher James Hartwell faces losing his land due to a territorial law requiring married landowners for property claims. In desperation, he agrees to a mail-order bride arrangement with a mysterious woman named Eleanor, who arrives veiled and strangely silent, communicating only through written notes. James marries her in a hasty ceremony, believing her to be a simple immigrant seeking security. But on their wedding night, Eleanor finally speaks and reveals an identity that changes everything. She's not who she claimed to be, and her reasons for seeking this marriage run far deeper than simple survival. As secrets unravel and the truth emerges, James must decide whether to honor his vows to a woman who deceived him or lose everything he's worked for. This is a story of desperation, deception, unexpected honor, and the surprising forms that love can take on the unforgiving Texas frontier. Chapter 1. A Desperate Arrangement. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late August, delivered by the postal rider who made the circuit from Amarillo to the outlying ranches twice weekly. James Hartwell stood on his porch, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana already soaked through from the relentless Texas heat, and stared at the official territorial seal embossed on the envelope. Nothing good ever came in envelopes with official seals. He was right. The letter informed him that due to new territorial regulations aimed at encouraging settlement and family establishment, all land claims over 500 acres would be reviewed. Unmarried claimants would be required to either marry within 60 days or forfeit their holdings to married settlers willing to work the land. The policy was designed to prevent land speculation and encourage stable communities. To James, it felt like legalized theft wrapped in bureaucratic language. James Hartwell was 34 years old, and he'd been working this land for 12 years, first as a ranch hand, then as foreman, and finally as owner, after the previous proprietor died and left him the property in recognition of his loyalty and hard work. His wife Clara had died 4 years ago in childbirth, taking their unborn son with her. Since then, James had thrown himself into the ranch with single-minded determination, building the herd to nearly 200 head of cattle, improving the grazing lands, and constructing a solid ranch house that could withstand the brutal Texas weather. Now, because he grieved alone instead of remarrying, the territorial government wanted to take it all away. James crumpled the letter in his fist, rage and desperation warring in his chest. 60 days. He had 60 days to find a wife or lose everything he'd built, everything Clara had died building alongside him. The irony was bitter. Clara had always wanted to expand the ranch, to make it a legacy for their children. Now her absence was the reason that legacy was threatened. He rode into Amarillo the next day, a 2-hour journey across sun-baked plains where heat waves made the horizon shimmer like water. The town had grown considerably in recent years, transforming from a rough cattle depot into something approaching civilization. There was a proper general store now, a bank, a hotel, even a small newspaper office. James tied his horse outside Murphy's saloon and pushed through the doors into the dim interior. The saloon keeper, Frank Murphy, was a pragmatic Irishman who'd seen enough of frontier life to be surprised by nothing. He listened to James's situation while polishing glasses with methodical efficiency. "You're not the first man to come in here with that problem," Frank said when James finished. "That damned law has every bachelor rancher in the panhandle scrambling. Some are marrying Mexican girls from across the border. Some are sending for mail-order brides. Some are just giving up and selling out cheap." "I'm not selling," James said flatly. "That land is mine. I've earned it with 12 years of work." Frank nodded. "Then you need a wife. And fast." He reached under the counter and pulled out a newspaper from Kansas City, folded to a particular page. Matrimonial advertisements. Women looking for husbands out west. Men looking for wives willing to come to the frontier. It's how my cousin solved his problem last year. Got himself a German widow with 3 kids. They're doing fine now." James stared at the columns of small print, women describing themselves in economical language, listing skills and attributes like cattle at auction. "Respectable widow, 28, excellent cook, seeks hard-working rancher. Young woman of good character, 22, experienced with children, desires marriage to honest man." It felt wrong somehow, reducing marriage to a business transaction. But then again, hadn't most marriages throughout history been exactly that? Practical arrangements made for survival and mutual benefit? He copied down 3 addresses of women whose advertisements seemed promising, paid Frank for the newspaper, and rode back to the ranch feeling hollowed out. That evening, by lamplight, he composed 3 letters. He was honest in all of them. He explained about the territorial law, about needing to marry quickly, about the hard work ranch life demanded. He described his property, his cattle, his modest but comfortable home. He mentioned Clara briefly, just enough to explain why he was available. He didn't mention love or romance because he had neither to offer. This was survival, pure and simple. 2 weeks passed with no responses. James continued his daily work with mechanical efficiency, checking fences, rotating cattle between grazing areas, maintaining equipment. But anxiety gnawed at him constantly. He had 43 days left, then 40, then 35. He was beginning to consider more drastic options, marrying one of the saloon girls, proposing to the widow Thompson, who lived 10 miles south despite knowing she couldn't stand him, when the reply finally came. The letter was written in elegant handwriting on quality paper. Dear Mr. Hartwell, your advertisement reached me through unusual circumstances, and I believe we may be able to help each other. I am a woman of 26 years, educated and capable, seeking marriage for reasons I cannot fully explain in correspondence. I will say only that I am alone in the world and in need of protection and security that marriage can provide. I am willing to travel to Texas and marry quickly if you can assure me of fair treatment and basic respect. I ask no promises of affection, only safety and a place to call home. If these terms are acceptable, wire funds for travel and I will arrive on the next available train. Yours in good faith, Eleanor Price. Something about the letter troubled James, though he couldn't identify exactly what. The phrasing was oddly formal, almost evasive. Reasons I cannot fully explain suggested secrets, possibly dangerous ones, but 28 days remained before his deadline, and desperation made poor company for caution. He rode to Amarillo, sent a telegram to the address Eleanor had provided in St. Louis, and wired money for train passage. Her response arrived the next day. Arriving Amarillo August 29th, 2 p.m. train. Will wear blue traveling dress and veil. Thank you for this opportunity. E.P. The brevity was somehow more unnerving than the previous letter. James had 11 days to prepare for a wedding to a complete stranger. He cleaned the house obsessively, bought new sheets and curtains, stocked the pantry with supplies from town. He arranged with the circuit preacher to perform a ceremony on August 29th at 4 o'clock, giving Eleanor time to arrive and catch her breath before being married to a man she'd never met. The morning of August 29th dawned clear and brutally hot. James dressed in his best clothes, a pressed white shirt, black vest and trousers, polished boots he rarely wore. He looked at himself in Clara's old mirror and barely recognized the man staring back, nervous, desperate, about to marry a stranger for no reason except bureaucratic necessity. He wondered what Clara would think, then pushed the thought away. Clara was gone. This was survival. He arrived at the Amarillo train depot at 1:30, early enough to watch the clock tower tick through 30 agonizing minutes. Other people waited on the platform, ranch hands heading to work, a family with luggage bound for somewhere else, a merchant checking his pocket watch impatiently. At exactly 2 o'clock, the train arrived in a hiss of steam and screech of brakes. Passengers disembarked in small clusters. James scanned them anxiously, looking for a woman in a blue traveling dress. And then he saw her. She descended from the third passenger car with careful, deliberate movements. Her dress was indeed blue, well made but not expensive, practical for travel. But what struck James immediately was the veil, heavy black fabric that completely obscured her face, the kind widows wore to funerals. She carried a single carpet bag and moved with strange hesitancy, as if unsure of her surroundings. James approached slowly, removing his hat. Miss Price? Eleanor? The woman turned toward his voice and nodded but said nothing. Up close he could see nothing of her features through the veil's dark weave. Unease prickled along his spine. I'm James Hartwell. Welcome to Amarillo. She nodded again, still silent. When he reached for her bag, she handed it over without resistance. James gestured toward his wagon. The preacher is waiting at the church. We can marry today as planned, or if you need time to—" She shook her head firmly and pulled a small notepad and pencil from her pocket. She wrote quickly and showed him, "Today is fine. Let us proceed." Her handwriting matched the letter, elegant and controlled. James nodded slowly. "All right, then. The church is just up the street." They walked in silence, James leading the horse and wagon with Eleanor beside him, her veiled face turned straight ahead. People stared openly at the strange pair, and James felt his face heating with embarrassment and confusion. The church was small, whitewashed wood with a simple cross above the door. Reverend Mitchell waited inside, a kindly man in his 60s who'd performed Clara's funeral service. His eyes widened when he saw Eleanor's veil, but he had the grace not to comment. "Shall we begin?" James and Eleanor stood before the altar. The ceremony was mercifully brief. When Reverend Mitchell asked Eleanor to respond, she simply nodded, and James quickly said, "She agrees to keep things moving." The Reverend looked troubled but continued, "Do you, James Hartwell, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" James swallowed hard. "I do." "And do you, Eleanor Price, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Eleanor nodded firmly, then wrote on her pad, "I do." The Reverend blinked. "Well then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Texas, I pronounce you husband and wife." He looked at James. "You may kiss your bride." James lifted the veil slowly, his heart hammering. And in the dim light of the church, he finally saw Eleanor's face. She was younger than he'd expected, with dark hair pulled back severely, high cheekbones and striking green eyes that watched him with an intensity that bordered on desperation. But what struck him most was the scar, a thin white line running from her right ear to the corner of her mouth, pulling her face into a slight asymmetry. And when she opened her mouth, he understood why she'd been silent. Her tongue had been cut, not completely, but enough to make speech nearly impossible. Horror and pity flooded through James, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead gently, chastely, with all the respect he could muster. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. They signed the marriage certificate in silence, and suddenly James Hartwell had a wife again. A silent, scarred stranger who'd traveled halfway across the country to marry a man she'd never met. And he had absolutely no idea who she really was, or what secrets lay behind those desperate green eyes. The wagon ride back to the ranch stretched through the late afternoon heat like a journey through a fever dream. James sat beside Eleanor on the bench seat, hyper-aware of her presence in a way that made him uncomfortable. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her posture rigid, her veiled face turned toward the passing landscape. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but didn't know how to begin a conversation with someone who couldn't speak. The ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent, modest, buildings surrounded by endless grassland, a few scattered trees marking the creek line. James had always taken pride in what he'd built here, but seeing it now through a stranger's eyes, he worried it might seem too isolated, too rough. Eleanor showed no reaction, just continued her silent observation as they approached. He helped her down from the wagon with awkward formality, then carried her carpet bag to the house. "I'll show you around," he said, his voice too loud in the silence. Inside, he gestured to the main room, kitchen area on one side, sitting space with a fireplace on the other, 2 doors leading to bedrooms. "That's my room," he pointed to the left door. That one's available. You can take it." He couldn't bring himself to explain it had been meant as a nursery. Eleanor nodded and wrote on her pad, "Thank you." "You are kind." James felt a flush of shame. He wasn't being kind. He was being practical, following the terms of their arrangement, but her gratitude was genuine. He could see it in those intense green eyes. She pointed to the kitchen and raised her eyebrows questioningly. "Can you cook?" James asked. She nodded emphatically and wrote, "Very well. Taught by French chef in St. Louis." That detail struck James as odd. A woman educated enough to write elegantly, taught to cook by a French chef, yet desperate enough to marry a stranger? The pieces didn't fit together, but before he could pursue the thought, Eleanor was already moving around the kitchen, examining his supplies with the critical eye of someone who knew their way around food preparation. She found flour, eggs, butter, dried herbs. Within minutes, she was working with efficient, practiced movements. James retreated to do evening chores, feeding the horses, checking on the cattle in the near pasture, securing the barn. The familiar routine calmed his nerves somewhat. When he returned to the house, amazing smells greeted him. Eleanor had prepared a meal far beyond anything James had eaten since Clara died. Roasted chicken with herbs, vegetables cooked in butter, fresh biscuits that were somehow light and fluffy despite the altitude and heat. She'd even found his rarely used tablecloth and set the table properly. They ate in silence, but it was less awkward than before. Eleanor watched him taste the food, and when he nodded in appreciation, something like relief crossed her face. After dinner, she efficiently cleaned the dishes while James sat by the fireplace, unsure what came next. His mind kept circling back to the marriage certificate, to the legal reality that this woman was now his wife, to the unspoken expectations that typically came with wedding nights. Eleanor finished in the kitchen and approached him slowly. She held her notepad, and when James looked up, she showed him what she'd written. "We must talk. I owe you truth." James's stomach tightened. "All right." Eleanor gestured to the chairs by the fireplace, and they both sat. She began writing rapidly, showing him each page as she filled it. "My real name is not Eleanor Price, it is Eleanor Blackwood. I am the daughter of Judge Harrison Blackwood of St. Louis. 3 years ago I witnessed something I should not have seen." She paused to gauge his reaction, then continued writing. "My father was involved in corruption, taking bribes to fix trials, working with criminals. I discovered documents in his study. So I confronted him. He was furious that I knew." James felt ice forming in his stomach. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she wrote the next part. "He had his associates silence me. They held me down and cut my tongue so I could never testify against him. My father told everyone I had gone mad from female hysteria, that I had hurt myself. He locked me in an asylum for 2 years. The words blurred before James's eyes. The casual cruelty of it. A father mutilating his own daughter to protect his corruption. Eleanor was still writing. "6 months ago, a sympathetic nurse helped me escape. I have been hiding, using false names, moving from place to place. My father has connections everywhere. He wants me found and returned to the asylum or simply disappeared. When I saw your advertisement, I realized marriage to someone far from St. Louis, someone with no connections to that world, might be my only safety." She stopped writing and looked at him with those haunted green eyes. James sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. He'd married not just a stranger, but a fugitive, a woman being hunted by a corrupt judge with resources and reach. The implications were staggering. If this Judge Blackwood found her, if he sent men here, James could be arrested for harboring a runaway from legal custody. He could lose not just his ranch, but his freedom. Eleanor was writing again, faster now, desperately. "I understand if you want to annul the marriage. I understand if you are angry that I deceived you. But please, I beg you, do not send me back. If my father finds me, he will either kill me or lock me away forever. I would rather die here in Texas than return to that life." Her hand shook so badly the last words were barely legible. James stood and paced to the window, staring out at the darkening prairie. Everything in him screamed that this was too dangerous, too complicated. He should ride to Amarillo tomorrow, find a lawyer, get the marriage annulled, send Eleanor on her way before her father's reach extended to Texas. That was the smart choice, the safe choice. But as he stood there, he thought about Clara. Clara had been brave, had faced frontier hardships without complaint, had believed in helping people even when it was inconvenient. He turned back to Eleanor, who sat rigid in her chair, waiting for judgment. "Can you prove any of this? The corruption, your father's involvement?" Eleanor nodded eagerly and went to her carpetbag. She returned with a small oilcloth packet, carefully wrapped and sealed. Inside were folded papers, letters in elegant handwriting, ledgers showing payments, names and dates. James couldn't verify their authenticity, but they looked genuine. "You kept these all this time?" Eleanor wrote, "The nurse who helped me escape retrieved them from my father's study first. She knew I would need proof if I ever wanted justice. But proof means nothing without a voice to speak it." The bitter truth of that statement hung in the air. Without the ability to testify, these documents were just paper. Eleanor could never bring her father to justice, could never clear her own name. The best she could hope for was to hide and survive. James sat back down across from her. This Judge Blackwood, How far does his influence reach? Eleanor wrote quickly, all of Missouri, parts of Kansas and Arkansas. He has connections with railroad barons and politicians, but Texas is independent-minded. The territories here don't always cooperate with Eastern law. That's why I came here. Distance and jurisdiction are my only protection. James rubbed his face with both hands. If I keep you here, if we stay married, what happens when someone comes looking? Because eventually someone will come looking. Eleanor's face showed the first sign of hope since their conversation began. You would keep the marriage? Even knowing the danger? James met her gaze directly. I made vows today. Maybe the circumstances were unusual, but the promises were real. I said I'd protect you, respect you. I'm not the kind of man who goes back on his word. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears that spilled over onto her scarred cheek. She wrote with shaking hands, Thank you. I will be a good wife. I will work hard. I will ask nothing of you beyond safety and a place to hide. I know you loved your first wife. I am not trying to replace her. This is only survival. James felt a strange tightness in his chest. Clara, my first wife, she always said the measure of a person wasn't what they did when things were easy, but what they did when things were hard. I think she'd understand this choice. Eleanor wiped her eyes and wrote another question. The bedroom arrangements? James felt his face heat. Separate rooms. We're married on paper, but I'm not. I don't expect. We can be partners, allies. We don't have to be anything more than that. The relief on Eleanor's face was palpable. She wrote, Thank you for treating me with dignity. Many men would not. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the fire crackling, the enormity of their situation settling around them like dust after a storm. Finally, James spoke. We'll need a story. If anyone asks you're from St. Louis, your parents are dead. You came west seeking a fresh start. Simple backstory, hard to verify, common enough not to raise questions. You communicate through writing because of an illness that damaged your voice. Not suspicious, just unfortunate. Eleanor nodded and wrote, I can do that. I have been practicing being someone else for 6 months. James stood and stretched, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming him. It's late. We should sleep. Tomorrow we'll work on making this arrangement look legitimate. You'll need to learn the ranch work, meet the neighbors eventually, build a normal life here. Eleanor stood as well and impulsively reached out, touching his arm briefly. When he looked at her questioningly, she showed him her pad one final time. You are a good man, James Hartwell. I am fortunate to have found you. James didn't feel like a good man. He felt like a desperate rancher who'd stumbled into something far more complicated than a simple marriage of convenience. But as Eleanor retreated to her room and closed the door softly behind her, he realized something important. For the first time since Clara's death, he wasn't alone in this house. The presence wasn't what he'd expected, wasn't what he'd wanted, but it was real. And maybe in the harsh reality of frontier Texas, that was enough to build on. He banked the fire and went to his own room, lying awake long into the night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person in the house, soft footsteps, the creak of a bed, the quiet rustling of someone settling into an uncertain future. James stared at the ceiling and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He'd married to save his ranch, but in doing so he'd tied his fate to a woman being hunted by powerful enemies. The smart thing would be to run, to annul the marriage and pretend this had never happened. But James Hartwell had never been the kind of man who chose the smart thing over the right thing. Clara had loved that about him, even when it frustrated her. So he made a decision in the darkness of his room, a commitment that went beyond the legal words spoken in the church. He would protect Eleanor Blackwood. He would keep her secrets. He would stand between her and whatever forces came looking for her. And if that meant putting himself in danger, well, that was the price of doing what was right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be questions to answer, roles to play, a life to build from the strange foundation they'd laid today. But tonight, James let himself feel something he hadn't felt in 4 years, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. Eleanor needed him. Not his land, not his money, but him specifically, his protection, his honor, his willingness to stand against injustice. And somehow that need gave his life a meaning it had lacked since Clara's death. As sleep finally claimed him, James's last thought was a prayer, not to a specific God, but to whatever forces governed the frontier, that he'd have the strength and wisdom to navigate what came next. Because he had a feeling that marrying Eleanor Blackwood, whatever her real name was, had set events in motion that couldn't be stopped, only endured. And endurance, at least, was something James Hartwell knew how to do. The first week of their marriage unfolded in careful choreography, each of them learning the steps of their new roles. Eleanor proved to be exactly what she'd claimed, an exceptional cook, organized housekeeper, and surprisingly capable ranch hand. James woke each morning to find breakfast already prepared, the house tidied, and Eleanor dressed in practical work clothes that she'd somehow fashioned from fabric she'd found in the storage trunk. She learned quickly. James showed her once how to collect eggs from the small chicken coop he maintained, how to feed the horses, how to pump water from the well. Eleanor absorbed it all with the focused intensity of someone whose life depended on mastering new skills. Within 3 days, she was handling morning chores independently, freeing James to focus on the cattle and more demanding ranch work. They developed a system of communication that went beyond her notepad. Simple gestures for common questions. Pointing to the horizon meant someone was coming, tapping her wrist meant asking about time, touching her stomach indicated hunger or mealtime. Eleanor's inability to speak became just another aspect of their daily reality, no more remarkable than the heat or the endless wind across the plains. On the 8th day of their marriage, their first test arrived. Frank Murphy rode out from Amarillo with supplies James had ordered before Eleanor's arrival. James saw the dust cloud from a distance and felt his stomach tighten. This would be Eleanor's first interaction with someone from town. The first time their story would be examined by curious eyes. Eleanor was in the garden when Frank arrived, wearing a simple cotton dress and wide-brimmed hat, a basket of vegetables on her arm. James met Frank at the fence, accepting the supply crates with forced casualness. "I appreciate you bringing these out, Frank." The Irishman's eyes had already found Eleanor, studying her with the frank curiosity of someone who'd heard rumors and wanted to verify them personally. "So that's the bride," Frank said, keeping his voice low. "Whole town's been talking. Said you married some mysterious woman who wears a veil and doesn't talk." James bristled. "Her name is Eleanor. She's from St. Louis. She had an illness that damaged her vocal cords, so she communicates through writing. Nothing mysterious about it, just unfortunate." Frank had the grace to look slightly ashamed. "No offense meant, James. You know how people talk in small towns. There's not much entertainment except gossip." He raised his voice and called out, "Ma'am, Mrs. Hartwell. Pleased to make your acquaintance." Eleanor approached slowly, wiping dirt from her hands. She dipped her head in polite acknowledgement, but didn't offer to shake hands, maintaining a careful distance. Frank seemed uncertain how to proceed. James jumped in. "Eleanor, this is Frank Murphy. He runs the saloon in town and helps with supply deliveries." Eleanor pulled her ever-present notepad from her apron pocket and wrote, "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Murphy. Thank you for bringing supplies." She showed him the pad with a slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Frank read it and visibly relaxed. Whatever he'd expected, some strange invalid or suspicious foreign woman, Eleanor's polite, educated response disarmed him. "Well, now that's a fine hand you've got there, Mrs. Hartwell. My pleasure to help. And if you folks need anything from town, you just send word." He glanced at James. "Some of the ladies in town were asking if they might call on you. Pay their respects to the new bride. Mrs. Peterson from the general store. The Reverend's wife." James felt Eleanor tense beside him. Social calls meant more scrutiny, more questions, more opportunities for their story to unravel. But refusing would seem suspicious. "That would be fine," James said carefully. "Perhaps give us another week or two to get settled." Frank nodded agreeably. Of course, no rush." "Well, I'll be heading back. You folks take care now." After Frank disappeared down the road, Eleanor sagged against the fence, the strain of maintaining her composure visibly draining away. She wrote quickly, "How did I do? Was I convincing?" James touched her shoulder briefly, a gesture of reassurance. "You were perfect, natural. If anything, too educated for a simple ranch wife, but that'll just make people think I married well above my station." Eleanor managed a genuine smile at that. The next test came 3 days later when James's nearest neighbor, Dutch Peterson, rode over with his wife Margaret and their 3 young children. The Petersons had a ranch 7 miles south, and Dutch had been a friend since James first arrived in the territory. This visit couldn't be avoided or postponed. Dutch was the kind of man who showed up unannounced and expected hospitality. Eleanor saw them coming and met James's eyes with barely concealed panic. He took her hands in his, a gesture of solidarity. "Just be yourself. Be polite but reserved. Let me do most of the talking." She nodded and retreated to the house to prepare refreshments, her hands trembling slightly as she worked. Dutch Peterson was a jovial bear of a man with a booming laugh and no sense of personal boundaries. He slapped James on the back hard enough to bruise. "Heard you found yourself a wife. Thought I'd better come see if the rumors were true." His wife, Margaret, a practical woman with kind eyes and calloused hands, elbowed him sharply. "Dutch, mind your manners. You're not in a saloon." Eleanor emerged with a tray of lemonade and cookies she'd baked that morning. James made introductions, explaining Eleanor's condition with the story they'd practiced. Dutch looked sympathetic. "Shame about your voice, ma'am. But at least you can still understand folks, right?" Eleanor nodded and wrote on her pad, "Yes, I hear perfectly well. The illness only affected my ability to speak." Margaret Peterson studied Eleanor with the shrewd assessment of a woman who'd raised 3 children and run a frontier household for 15 years. "You're from St. Louis." Eleanor nodded and wrote, "Yes, came west seeking a fresh start after my parents passed." Margaret's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss. It's brave coming all this way alone." She glanced at James. "You're a lucky man, James Hartwell. Not many educated women would take on ranch life." The children, 2 boys and a girl ranging from 5 to 10 years old, stared at Eleanor with the unfiltered curiosity of the young. The youngest boy piped up, "Why can't you talk?" "Did a coyote bite your tongue?" Margaret looked mortified, but Eleanor actually laughed, a strange, soundless laugh that shook her shoulders. She knelt down to the boy's level and wrote, "No coyote. Just a bad sickness. But I can still hear you perfectly, and you have a very nice voice." The boy beamed, and just like that the children accepted her. They showed her a lizard they'd caught, asked about the chickens, and chatted away while Eleanor responded with nods and smiles and occasional written notes. Margaret watched this interaction with approval. "She's got a way with children," she said quietly to James. "That's a good sign." After the Petersons left, Eleanor collapsed onto the porch steps, emotionally exhausted. James sat beside her, and they watched the sun descend toward the horizon in companionable silence. Finally, Eleanor wrote, "They were nice. I felt guilty lying to them." James considered his response carefully. "We're not lying about the important things. You're from St. Louis. You did need a fresh start. The details we're leaving out. Those are for your protection, not to harm them." Eleanor looked at him with those penetrating green eyes. "Do you ever regret it? Marrying me? Taking on this burden?" James surprised himself by answering honestly. "Sometimes I'm scared of what might happen. But regret? No, this ranch was feeling like a prison before you arrived, a place I was defending out of stubbornness more than love. Now it feels like a home again, like something worth protecting for reasons beyond legal ownership." Eleanor's hand found his on the weathered wood of the porch step. It was the first time she'd initiated physical contact beyond practical necessity. Her palm was warm and calloused from work, and James found himself not pulling away. They sat like that, as the sky turned from blue to orange to purple. 2 people bound by necessity, learning to be bound by something more complicated. Not love, not yet, maybe never, but companionship, respect, and the strange intimacy that comes from shared secrets. The 3rd week brought their most serious test yet. James was in the north pasture mending fence when Eleanor came running, stumbling over the rough ground in her haste. Her face was pale with terror, and she was waving her notepad frantically. James dropped his tools and ran to meet her. The note read, 3 men on horses. Coming from the east. They look official. Badges. James's blood turned to ice. He scanned the horizon and saw them. 3 riders moving steadily toward the ranch, still a mile distant but unmistakably lawmen. "Go inside," he said urgently. "Stay in your room. Don't come out unless I call for you. If they ask, I'll say you're ill resting." Eleanor gripped his arm hard, her eyes wild with fear. "If they have a warrant, if they're looking specifically for me, what will you do?" James met her gaze and spoke the truth. "I'll protect you, whatever that takes." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded and ran for the house. James watched her go, then turned to face the approaching riders, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. If these men had warrants from Missouri, if Judge Blackwood had tracked his daughter to Texas, then James was about to make a choice that could cost him everything, his ranch, his freedom, possibly his life. But as the riders drew closer and he could make out their faces, James realized something important. He'd already made that choice the night Eleanor revealed who she was. The wedding vows had been spoken under false pretenses, but somewhere in the past 3 weeks, those vows had become real. Eleanor Blackwood, or whatever her true name was, had become his wife in more than just legal documentation. She'd become his responsibility, his partner, someone worth defending. The lead rider raised his hand in greeting as they approached the fence. "Afternoon. Looking for James Hartwell." James walked to meet them, his posture relaxed but his muscles coiled with tension. "That's me. What can I do for you, gentlemen?" The lead man was in his 40s with a weathered face and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much frontier justice. "Name's Deputy Marshal Tom Crawford. These are my associates, Deputies Blake and Morrison. We're investigating some claims of criminal activity in the territory." James kept his expression neutral. "Criminal activity around here? That's concerning. What kind of claims?" Crawford dismounted and pulled out a notebook. "Fraud, specifically. Mail-order bride schemes where women are brought here under false pretenses, then forced into situations they didn't agree to. We've had complaints from women's advocacy groups back east, so we're checking on recent marriages, making sure everything's legitimate." Relief flooded through James so powerfully he almost laughed. They weren't here for Eleanor specifically. This was a general investigation. "Well, you're welcome to check my situation. I married Eleanor Price, Eleanor Hartwell now, about 3 weeks ago. She came from St. Louis willingly. We had proper correspondence, legal ceremony performed by Reverend Mitchell in Amarillo. Nothing fraudulent about it." Crawford nodded, making notes. "We'd like to speak with your wife if possible, just to verify she's here of her own free will, that the arrangement is satisfactory to her." James felt the danger shift. If Eleanor appeared before these lawmen, if they asked for identification or documentation beyond the marriage certificate, the situation could spiral quickly. "My wife isn't well today. She has a condition that makes speaking difficult, and she's resting. But I can wake her if it's absolutely necessary." Deputy Blake, younger and more aggressive, spoke up. "It is necessary. We need to verify directly with the woman that she's not being held against her will or coerced." James felt anger rising, but kept it controlled. "Marshal Crawford, my wife came here seeking security and a fresh start. I've provided both. She works hard because she chooses to, eats well, has her own room, is treated with complete respect. I understand you're doing your job, but I'd appreciate not having my integrity questioned in my own home." Crawford held up a placating hand. "No disrespect intended, Mr. Hartwell, but I'm sure you understand we need to be thorough. Tell you what, we'll wait while you ask your wife if she's willing to come out and answer a few quick questions. If she confirms everything's fine, we'll be on our way." It was a reasonable request, and refusing would only increase suspicion. James nodded slowly. "I'll ask her. Wait here." He walked to the house on legs that felt unsteady, his mind churning. Inside, he found Eleanor pressed against the wall beside a window, watching the deputies through a gap in the curtains. Her face was ghostly pale, and her hands shook so badly she could barely hold her notepad. James took both her hands in his, forcing her to focus on him instead of the window. "Listen carefully. They're not here for you specifically. This is a general investigation about bride fraud. All they want is confirmation that you're here willingly, that you're being treated well. Can you do that?" Eleanor's breathing was rapid and shallow. She was on the edge of panic. James squeezed her hands firmly. "Eleanor, look at me. You can do this. You've handled the neighbors, the supply riders, everyone else. These men don't know who you are. They're just checking boxes on a list. Walk out, show them you're fine, write your answers, and they'll leave. I'll be right beside you the entire time." She closed her eyes, taking deep breaths, visibly forcing herself to calm down. When she opened them again, some of the terror had been replaced by determination. She pulled her hands free and wrote quickly, "If they ask to see identification." James had already thought of this. "Your marriage certificate identifies you as Eleanor Price. That's legal documentation. They have no reason to question it, unless we give them one. Just stay calm and be yourself." Eleanor nodded and straightened her dress, smoothing her hair back. James walked out first, Eleanor a step behind him. Crawford and his deputies turned from where they'd been examining the ranch buildings. "This is my wife, Eleanor," James said, his hand moving protectively to Eleanor's back. "Eleanor, these gentlemen are investigating bride fraud cases. They'd like to ask you a few questions." Eleanor stepped forward and curtsied slightly, an oddly formal gesture that somehow fit her educated background. Crawford removed his hat respectfully. "Ma'am, I apologize for the intrusion. We just need to verify a few things." "Are you here of your own free will?" Eleanor nodded emphatically and pulled out her notepad. Writing, completely voluntary. "Mr. Hartwell and I corresponded honestly, and I came to Texas knowing exactly what to expect." Crawford read the note, and his expression softened. "Forgive me asking, ma'am, but the writing, is there a reason you communicate this way?" Eleanor wrote again, "Illness damaged my vocal cords. I can hear perfectly, but cannot speak clearly enough to be understood. My husband has been very patient with this limitation." Crawford nodded sympathetically. "That must be difficult, but you're being treated well? You have everything you need?" Eleanor smiled, and it was genuine. James could see it. She wrote, "I have more than I need. A comfortable home, good food, meaningful work, and a husband who treats me with respect and kindness. I'm exactly where I wish to be, Marshal. Thank you for your concern, but it is unnecessary." She showed the notepad to all three deputies, making sure each could read her words. Deputy Morrison, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. "One last question, ma'am. Do you have family back east who might be worried about you? Anyone we should notify that you're safe?" James felt Eleanor's back stiffen under his hand. She wrote carefully, "My parents are deceased. I have no close family remaining. That is part of why I sought a new life in Texas, to build a family here." Crawford closed his notebook with an air of finality. "Well, everything seems to be in order here. Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell, thank you for your cooperation. We'll be moving on." He tipped his hat to Eleanor. "Ma'am, I hope your voice condition improves. And congratulations on your marriage." The deputies mounted their horses and rode south toward the next ranch on their list. James and Eleanor stood frozen on the porch until the riders disappeared from view. Then Eleanor's legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the porch steps, her whole body shaking. James sat beside her and wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her against his chest. She pressed her face into his shirt and sobbed, silent, shaking sobs that spoke of terror finally released. "You did perfectly," James murmured, holding her steady. "They suspected nothing. You were calm and convincing and everything you needed to be." Eleanor pulled back enough to write with trembling hands, "I was so frightened. When he asked about family, I thought he knew. I thought my father had sent them." James tightened his hold on her. "Your father didn't send them. They were doing routine checks. And even if someone does come looking for you someday, we'll face it together. You're not alone in this anymore, Eleanor. You have someone standing with you." She looked up at him with those red-rimmed green eyes, and something passed between them, an understanding deeper than words. They weren't just partners in deception anymore. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks of shared meals and morning chores and practiced lies, they'd become something real. Not the romance of storybooks, but the solid partnership of two people learning to trust each other with their deepest vulnerabilities and darkest truths. That night, after a quiet dinner neither of them had much appetite for, Eleanor wrote a longer message than usual. "Thank you for defending me today, for standing beside me, for not giving me away even though it would have been safer for you. I know this marriage started as necessity for both of us, but I want you to know that I am grateful every day for the home you have given me. Not just the physical house, but the feeling of being safe, of being protected, of mattering to someone. You have given me back my life, James Hartwell. I will never forget that." James read the note twice, feeling emotions he wasn't ready to name swirling in his chest. "You've given me something too," he said quietly. "Purpose. Something to care about beyond just keeping the ranch running. I didn't realize how empty my life had become until you filled it with something more than routine." Eleanor smiled at him, a real smile, reaching her eyes, and James felt something shift in the foundations of their careful arrangement. They were building something here, something neither of them had planned but both of them needed. And whatever challenges came next, they would face them as what they had become: partners, allies, and perhaps eventually something even more.